Please forgive me if I stutter, hesitate, or mispronounce anything while reading this work. This is Chapter 4 of Passerine, Chapter 4, Part 1. Your trigger warnings for this chapter are violence and depictions of violence, assault, and death. Let us begin. 3 men stood on a balcony where there were once 2, a mortal king, a mortal prince, and their red-eyed teacher. In the gardens below, travelers were gathering, most weary from their journey from every corner of the vast kingdom. Even now, more and more were still pouring into the capital city, staring in wide-eyed confusion, a conscription notice tucked into their pockets or crushed between nervous fingers. All able-bodied citizens of the kingdom are called to the king's castle, the letters all said, carried from bustling towns to quiet villages by messengers on the kingdom's most swift-footed horses and carrier birds, taking to the familiar wind-curved routes. War is coming, and it is time to defend your motherland. The conscription letter had gone on to specify that only those over the age of 18 were to be included in the king's army. Many had chosen to ignore that. Among the horde trickling slowly into the heart of the kingdom was a brown-haired boy a year shy of the simulated age. He kept the hood of his battered cloak up, so no one could see the traces of boyhood still erect into his skin like a brand. Someone noticed. It was a girl with the hair as pink as hibiscus she grew in her garden. She had lived in the city all her life. Once, a man with the same hibiscus pink hair had walked into her flower shop, his eyes bleak and unfocused. He had asked her if she had any yellow roses for sale, and had bought it all. It was only later that she realized who the man was, but by then he had already left, heading towards the woods with that broad-boarded city. Now she marched along the city streets that had become unfamiliar over the course of a week. She had left her garden to the care of an elderly neighbor. A sign was left on her flower shop door, telling hopeful customers that it was closed indefinitely. There was nothing else to do now but follow the course of the crowd, keeping an eye on the stranger that was definitely much younger than her, wondering whether or not he'd outlive her. They passed underneath the castle gates, where a woman they called the captain kept a watchful eye. She was under orders to turn away anyone too young, too sick, too old, but every time she looked into their eyes, she only saw herself. She'd clawed her way to this position, made sure to earn her reputation, and had stood guard over the royal family for over a decade. It was her stubbornness that got her to where she was, adorned by medallions from the king, both old and new. It was stubbornness that she saw in these people now. So while she did her duty by bearing the way for the youngest, the sickest, and the oldest, if she turned away for a moment when an aged warrior did her best to hide the wrinkles on the backs of her scarred hands, or when a 17-year-old boy pulled his hood lower to his face, or when a strong-jawed smith from the city limped by her with a broken foot that wasn't quite healed yet, well, she would consider that her duty too. By the time the boy and the flower shopkeeper found themselves in the garden, it was crowded. People stood shoulder to shoulder, pushing and pulling like a tide on the trampled remains of the dead queen's flowers. The shopkeeper grimaced as her boots threaded across petals and stems, violently returning them to their soil. The boy did not notice the flowers at all. He was staring up at the balcony, looking at the man whose call was answered by thousands. Most of them had never seen their king before. They've all heard the stories of a boy crowned on the eve of his 16th birthday after his father's mysterious disappearance, or death, or assassination, depending on which rumors you believed, and guided by a strange advisor. A kingdom of peace would never have had any reason to know the name Technoblade, but those who heard the folk story of a red-eyed emperor from a cold and distant land whispered amongst themselves at the resemblance, or the coincidence, or whatever word they could use to explain the uneasiness brewing in their gut. The stories also said that the king was a kind and generous, with a starry-eyed ambition that came with his youth, and that the younger prince could charm 1,000 detractors with his wit and humor. Standing together, they seemed to be as different as night and day, one dark, one light, but no one could deny that they shared brotherhood etched into their regal bearing, both products of a boyhood almost drowned in etiquette and decorum. The prince shifted closer to his brother. "That's a lot of people, Will," he murmured. The king's eyes were unreadable in the hazy light of the clouded afternoon. "Not enough," he replied. Their tutor crossed his arms as he surveyed the gathering crowd, already calculating battle positions and drafting strategies. This was, after all, not his first war, nor did he think it would be his last. "I'll oversee training as much as I can, for as long as we have the time. I've identified some potential battalion leaders from the guards and the people who came earlier. I'll delegate the responsibility of training the newer recruits." "Which is most of them," Wilbur pointed out. "They've never had a reason to learn how to fight before this." "You underestimate your people, Wilbur," Technoblade replied patiently. "There are other reasons besides war. Look there. See that person with a bow? They're a hunter, used to shooting down fast-moving targets, which makes them an asset for our archery line. Folks from the mountain regions are used to riding on horseback, so there's our cavalry already established. Miners and smiths are used to swinging sharp and heavy objects around. Give them broadswords instead of pickaxes and hammers, and we'll be ready to go." Wilbur cut him with a bemused look. "You sound almost optimistic. Did you hit your head on the wall this morning?" "I've seen worse odds," Tommy scoffed. "This is different from all your war books, Techno. This is real life." He did not notice the knowing look shared between his brother and their tutor. "Anyway," Technoblade continued, "I've reached out to mercenary guilds to supplement our offensive. Our Kofurs can handle the hit. After all, the kingdom has only been busy with trade for decades." "And if all goes to shirt anyway?" Tommy asked quietly. Technoblade's expression hardened. "It won't." "How can you be so sure?" demanded the young prince. "From what I've been hearing, we're nothing more than a bunch of poor saps armed with twigs against this, what do they call themselves?" "The Green Army," Wilbur replied, not taking his eyes off the people below them. "Ridiculous name if you ask me," Technoblade said. Tommy did not laugh, as he usually would. "That message you received said they massacred an entire town, Wilbur," he joked out. "An entire town, wiped out overnight like ants." Wilbur's hands tightened around the balcony railings, his knuckles turning white as he squeezed. "They were taken by surprise. We will not be so unfortunate." None of them said the obvious, which was the fact that if Wilbur had not held his secret so close to his chest, the town that once sat on their northern border might have survived. They might have been warned. They could have been saved from their merciless doom. Hypotheticals, Technoblade had told them before, were worthless, and only crippled their way forward. But it still sat in the uneasy silence between them, broken only by the tutor saying, "Other towns along the Green Army's route have been evacuated. We should be expecting refugees to arrive in the city in 3 days, but the temporary camps will be finished and ready by then." "And what's the status on the army itself?" "Based on the spies' reports, we have half a month, at most, before they arrive at the valley, which gives us another week to prepare the troops before we set out. The armory should be done tallying and divvying up weapons by tomorrow, and caravans have been loaded with other supplies." "And the other things we planned?" "Gathering the materials as we speak. The alchemists are working as fast as they can. Given that it's delicate work, we should have it done before we go." "Good." Wilbur raised his head towards the sun, breathing in the last sweet winds of spring. As he did, Tommy and Technoblade were the only ones to notice the fresh scratch marks running down the pale column of his throat. Tommy opened his mouth to speak, but was silenced by the quiet shake of Techno's head. "I guess it's time." In one smooth motion, Technoblade jumped onto the balcony railings, balancing precariously like an acrobat on a tightrope, his beloved trident in his hand. He drove the butt of the trident against the railings, producing a sound like a bell tolling. Over and over until the crowd was silent, their attention caught. "Your king," he shouted, "will now speak. I suggest you listen." He dropped back between Tommy and Wilbur, who gave him a grateful smile before turning back to their people, their army. "Friends," Wilbur began, his voice carrying out over the still crowd, now hanging on to his every word. "I see you all from where I stand. I understand you are afraid. You are confused. Years ago I promised you peace on my father's crown, and now I call you to war. This is nothing less than treason. Rest assured, I will be facing the consequences for it." The crowd stirred. Even Tommy looked to his brother in surprise, a question swiftly dying on his lips as Wilbur spoke on. "But that will be later on," the king continued. "For now we face an enemy that has mercilessly slaughtered our brethren on the northern border. That is what we shall keep in mind as we ready to face them. More than a battle to defend ourselves, this is a war of revenge. We shall remember the innocence lost in this nonsensical greed of our invaders, and I vow to deliver you your vengeance on a silver platter." Techno's eyes darkened, but he did not interrupt. His gaze drifted to the marble pavilion sitting in the distance, right where the crowd stopped. Its chest had pilfered. The blunted training weapons melted down to make sharper, deadlier blades. The ivy tumbling from its roof swayed slightly in the wind, offering him a brief glimpse at the empty, dust-covered floor beyond. He wondered if he'd ever set foot in it again. The shopkeeper was the only one not watching the king as he spoke of bravery and keeping the faith. Instead, she followed the tutor's far-off gaze, but all she could see was a small white building, overgrown with weeds. "This will not be the end of our nation," the king said with a note of finality, his dark eyes sweeping across the gathered crowd, but not seeing their faces at all. He spread his arms as he welcomed an embrace from someone no one else could see. "It has stood for centuries, and it will stand for centuries more. We will see our enemies burning, my friends, and I will scatter the ashes of their graves, of the people they took from us. And anyone who survives the fire will wish they had perished in the flames, and not by my hands. My only hope is that you might feel the same, to trust that you are in the most capable hands I could find." He turned to the tutor. "You are in safe keeping and guidance of General Technoblade. Together we will defend the kingdom or die trying." The silence of the crowd gave way to thunderous applause, the exultant crying of hundreds of people who did not know, truly, what awaited them on the battlefield. The aged warrior with the scarred hands was intimately familiar with violence and turned bitterly away from the excitement. She had been like them once, but no longer. They would learn sooner or later, but it would not be the gentle lesson. However, they were united in some things. They trusted their young king and their prince. They trusted their general, and they wished to see their enemies burn. The boy in the crowd felt that unity down to his bones. This is it, he thought. This was what it meant to be part of something, to belong. He felt a smile creep on into his face, and soon he was joining the noise, hollering until his lungs began to ache, joining in the people's furious glee. He was going to hold that line. He was going to drive the enemy back and protect the land that raised him, and he was going to be a hero. At 17 years old, Tubbo was the oldest he'd ever been, but he never felt so young. One person did not seem impressed by the king's words. The tutor-turned-general was staring at the king, his mouth on a thin line of disapproval. "Since when did I get the promotion?" Technoblade asked slowly. Wilbur shrugged, dismissive. "You're already acting like a general, anyway. But Technoblade." The king's voice turned cold as he stared his tutor down. "You promised to help me. Was that a lie?" Technoblade's eyes flashed dangerously. "Careful, Wilbur," he said quietly. "You're forgetting who you're talking to." Wilbur blinked, his eyes suddenly glaring. He opened his mouth at some sort of retort, perhaps an apology, but then there was Tommy, brilliant, loud Tommy, leaning so far over the railings, Technoblade had to pull him back by the back of his shirt. When he turned to them, he was beaming, his eyes bright in the afternoon gloom. "We're going to win," Tommy said, his ears still ringing with the crowd's approval. "We're actually going to win, aren't we?" Wilbur and Technoblade exchanged one glance, and all was forgiven. The conversation shelved for another day. The general still looked at the king with something close to concern, and the dark circles under the king's eyes were getting harder and harder to ignore each day. But none of that mattered anymore. If Tommy could say they were going to win, then by gods, neither of them could tell him otherwise. Not when he looked the happiest he'd been in a month. "By this time next month, we'll be back to worrying about trade routes and some bothersome psychopants," Wilbur assured him. "What in the world's a psychopath?" "Gods," the king gave his brother a look of equal parts annoyed and adoring. "Remind me to hire a better linguistics tutor for you when we get home." Tommy rolled his eyes. "Good luck finding someone who can stand me. I'll chase anyone away in 3 days, at most. Bet your whole darn life on it." Wilbur grinned at Technoblade. "I can think of one person. Techno, will you?" "Finish that sentence," Technoblade drawled in his usual monotone manner, "and I will end your bloodline right on the balcony. I will throw you off. Witnesses be darned." As the king and the prince dissolved into laughter, for one, shining in the moment, children again, Technoblade found himself smiling. The sky was dark and bleak, but there, on that balcony, there was sunlight. "It's you and me," said Technoblade, putting one hand on top of Tommy's head and the others on Wilbur's shoulder. "One more time."